Now, got choked. Welcome back, class. We're going to talk a few minutes now about maximizing utility. So we left it in the last segment talking about diminishing margin utility. And now we're going to talk a few minutes about maximizing utility and how we go about doing that. One thing you'll notice in this chapter is I've parsed it out into, I guess, some smaller segments. Because if you read your text, at some point in that chapter, in chapter 7, the authors talk about the concepts in chapter 7 being some of the more difficult concepts, especially when you get into the part about indifference curves that we'll get to a little later. Talk about these being some extremely difficult concepts. So I thought I would parse these out in some smaller segments than maybe I have in the past. So we're going to talk about maximizing utility. And in the model of maximizing utility, the model is based on, as economists usually do, they're trying to simplify the complex world that we function in. And to try to simplify this model of utility, they make the assumption that you're going to spend your entire budget constraint, whatever that budget is, you're going to spend it in its entirety. So there's no, and they set the assumptions that you can't borrow, so you can't use your credit card to get future dollars to bring them into the present, and there's no savings possible. So you can't take part of your budget and sock it away either under your mattress or in, a savings account or something to use in subsequent time periods. And they define the budget constraint as a restriction that total spending cannot exceed the budget available. So that's your parameter, that's your restriction when you're trying to maximize your total utility number in a given time period. And one way to look at your budget constraint, and again, utility, the concept of utility is it's the satisfaction and benefit from, typically say, from consuming a good or service. I sometimes like to add a little caveat. It's consuming an enjoyable good or service. So some goods and services are much more enjoyable than others. So you're going to gravitate more toward those than maybe you do with some goods or services that may not be as enjoyable. And if you look at your potential budget constraint, you've got X number of dollars in your budget. Some of it goes to paying your rent. Some of it's got to do with transportation. You have car payments. You've got to pay for gas, insurance. You've got food, clothing, entertainment. You've got a lot of partitions to that budget constraint. And one thing that if you listen to CNN and if you listen to Fox or I don't know MSNBC or ABC or whatever news stations you listen to, the talking heads are concerned that once, especially those individuals that are out of school and having to start to repay these student loans, what's that going to do to the budget constraints? How's that going to impact the consumption in the economy going forward, especially when it comes to home buying? So when you think about budget constraints, also think about the chunks or the percentage of your budget constraint that you would allocate to individual components, because there's only so many dollars in a budget constraint. Let's say your budget constraint is $1,000 a month, or maybe it's $2,000 a month, whatever that budget constraint is. You've got to allocate that among multiple competing goods and services for some dollar of your budget constraint. Also, if you're listening to the news, and it's always an issue, but especially with the senior population, once they get older, and you're hearing the inflation numbers are running about year over year. I think for 2023, they're about 3% or something. And I saw some numbers on Social Security that talked about, well, the seniors, it looks like, are going to get a bump in Social Security of, I don't know, like 3.2% or something. So 0.2% greater than inflation, which is not really enough to even worry about. You're just barely keeping up with inflation. But consumers are faced with, with food prices that may be greater than 3%. They're talking about gasoline prices greater than 3%, electricity, either natural gas or your propane to heat and cool your home. And there's just a lot of things that on a senior population that's going to tax that budget constraint not to count. I mean, as you get older, a much larger chunk of your budget has to go to healthcare. I mean, you've got pharmaceuticals, you've got doctor's visits, you may have some inpatient stays in the hospital. So you've got a lot of things tugging at that budget constraint. And that's why this is extremely important in this chapter, that you understand these concepts, because you're in school, maybe, living on SpaghettiOs or something, but once you get out and get a job, you're going to have to really manage that budget constraint. When you're in school, it's, you've got, maybe you're staying in the dorm, maybe you're on the meal plan, maybe you've got books that you have to purchase, depending on how close to campus you are. I mean, there's just a lot of things impacting that budget, but trust me, it gets a lot more complicated once you get out of school and move in, as some professors say, into the real world. But once you move into that world, it gets a lot more complicated. So understanding what we're talking about with budget constraints and margin utilities and consumer choice, it may be one of those, chapters in a textbook that you say, man, I just got to learn this enough to get through the test. But this is going to be a foundation, not only for your personal consumption, but if you go to work for a corporation or a government agency, or you go to work for a firm that's generating profits, and we'll get into this in chapters, 8, 9, 10 in the textbook, this utility maximization, decisions at the margin, opportunity costs, self-interest. I mean, all of that was going to be the fundamental tools that you can stick in your toolbox and take with you, and hopefully make you a more successful individual once you get out into the workplace. And as we go through this maximizing utility, it's driving your buying and allocation of your budget, and how you allocate dollars to the chunks that are taken out of your budget. And also remember that this is going to be driven by, what did we say? The marginal decision rule. Marginal benefit greater than marginal cost, you do it. Marginal benefit less than marginal cost, you don't do it. Marginal benefit equals marginal cost, you are maximizing net benefits at that point. And the marginal decision rule allows you to allocate your budget. And with the model, it's between goods and services to create the highest total utility possible. That's in the model with two goods. Once you get out, and if you get away from them, I try to make this work in the real world, you're talking about balancing marginal utilities among an almost infinite number of choices that are banging against that budget constraint. And so you're looking at the marginal, and we'll kind of go through the formulas that they have in the textbook. If you're looking at the marginal benefit of X, that's equal to the marginal utility of X divided by the price of X. The marginal cost of X is equal to the marginal utility of Y divided by the price of Y. And at that point, the marginal cost is actually the opportunity cost of buying X. It's the marginal opportunity of consuming X, let's say. And what you want to end up is a formula or end up in a position where the marginal benefit of X equals the marginal cost of X. And that's actually, as they show you in the text, it's actually saying the marginal utility of X over the price of X equals the marginal utility of Y over the price of Y. That at that point sets marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost. And remember, we're talking about marginal benefits and marginal cost, and that equates to the marginal utility of a good or service divided by the price of that good or service. The marginal utility of a certain good or service is going, or the marginal benefit is going to increase as the price of that goes down. Remember, if you've got a ratio, so the marginal benefit of X is equal to the marginal utility of X divided by the price of X. And if you've got the price of X going down, what's going to happen? The marginal utility of X for a given dollar of X is going to rise. Remember, denominator gets smaller, the ratio what? Gets bigger. Then think about just a fraction. So what's bigger, a fourth or a half? Well, a half's bigger because the denominator is what? 2 is less than 4. Think of it, you go back to your, and this is where students, and I've said in some other chapters, don't make this any more complicated than it really is. You're thinking about marginal utilities, you're thinking about ratios. And so that marginal benefit of X is going to increase as the price of X goes down because that ratio gets bigger. The marginal cost of X is going to get bigger if the price of Y goes down because that ratio gets bigger. So just think about that as we kind of go through these formulas. So what happens is if the marginal utility of X divided by the price of X is greater than the marginal utility of Y divided by the price of Y, greater, marginal benefits greater than the marginal cost, you're going to take dollars from Y and shift them over to X. You're going to spend more X. You're going to spend more X because the marginal utility of X divided by the price of X is greater than the marginal utility of Y divided by the price of Y, and that's because the price of X is going down. And you're going to have gains from this pricing differential by reallocating between X and Y until that greater than sign goes away, until that greater than sign either turns into a negative sign or hopefully it turns into an equal sign, because at that point you're maximizing net benefits. And one of the things to keep in mind about when you're talking about maximizing utility, our models that economists develop and utilize on a daily basis, again, they are trying to simplify a complex world. And what happens in the complex world is, and they give the example in the text, I think, about maybe one of the goods or services are ice cream bars. And it's the problem of divisibility. You and I both know that you can't go to the cash register at the grocery store and say, hey, I want to buy a third of an ice cream bar. That's not going to work. But there are very few goods in the world of consumption that are completely divisible. The assumptions in the model then may not be realistic, but it gives the economist something to work with and gives the economist a mechanism to explain how marginal utility rule works. And then somewhere in the text, there's a couple of things I want to make sure you understand. Utility maximization is the greatest total utility from a given budget constraint. That's a goal of utility maximization. How much total utility can I get from a given budget constraint? I can get more total utility from a $2,000 budget constraint than I can from a $1,500 constraint, than I can from $1,000, than I can from $500. So you've got a certain budget constraint, and it's, again, depending on prices and, utility estimations for a particular good or service, but you're trying to maximize that total utility. Total outlays equals the budget available. Marginal utility divided by price are equal to all you want to continue to reallocate dollars from your budget among all of the goods and services that you consume during a time period until the marginal utility of, A equals the marginal utility of B, divided by price, C divided by price, all the way out to infinity. So you can have a marginal utility function that's going to have a multitude of goods and services. But the key to it is, if you want to maximize net benefits, you want to consume and you want to allocate dollars among all of those potential goods and services until they all have equal signs. And then they talk about the law of demand, and they talk about the utility maximization in demand, and the individual's demand curve. And again, go back to the marginal utility, marginal benefit greater than marginal cost. If the marginal utility of X divided by the price of X, what happens if the price of X drops? That ratio gets bigger. And the law of demand states that is, demand curve's downward sloping because as price drops, you consume more of a good or service. And so that's how the authors tie, and economists in general, tie utility maximization and the construction of the demand curve together. And they go into it in great detail in the text. But at the end of the day, we're looking at ratios, what's happening to those ratios. Price is in the denominator of a ratio. So as prices go down, ratios get bigger. And again, it's the marginal utility of a dollar, of a given dollar. And so that's going to get bigger as the price, the denominator, gets smaller. And so the law of demand, if you are a maximizer, and economists assume that everybody's a maximizer because they assume for everybody more is preferred to less. So we're all wanting more as opposed to less. And so we economists can assume we're all maximizers. As price declines, you buy more. And again, that's the rationale with the downward sloping demand curve, as we've learned in some of the previous chapters. And again, they keep harping on, and it's something that you as students need to remember: when the price of a good or service decreases, the marginal utility per dollar increases. And that's what drives the marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost. That's why you want to use the marginal decision rule to continue to allocate dollars among those, and the model is two goods or services. In reality, it's multiple goods or services. You want to continue to allocate your dollars among all of those until that point that you have equal signs across the board. The quantity to purchase depends on the goods price and the marginal utility to other goods. So you want to maximize marginal utility, total marginal utility, but you also want to maximize the marginal utility per dollar. And I'm going to go through one last thing, and then we're going to stop this segment and come back to another segment in a few minutes. But if you're the utility maximizing condition, and they've got a little chart in the text that explains this, and it's pretty straightforward. Utility maximizing condition is the marginal utility of X divided by the price of X equals the marginal utility of Y divided by the price of Y. Marginal utility of a good or service per dollar of that good or service. Because they also want you to understand that the marginal utility, or the utility maximizing condition, is not marginal utility of X equals marginal utility of Y. That's not the utility maximizing condition. It's the marginal utility of those two goods or services divided by the price of each one of those goods or services price. So that's what you're trying to drive to maximization. You're trying to maximize the net benefits, and you're trying to set that marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost. Let's stop there. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll jump into the third session of chapter 7. Talk to you in a few minutes.